So today's message is a special message. I want to make sure that you get your family gathered around, get your children, because the name of this message this morning is entitled The Ox in the Room. I'm pretty sure you're trying to figure out what in the world does that actually mean. Well, it's a play off of the phrase, the elephant in the room. You know, that's the phrase that sort of gives definition to the idea that there's a controversial or difficult topic or subject that everyone sort of knows is there, it's happening, but no one wants to discuss. And so this morning I want to pose a couple of questions that I've been thinking about. The first question is, why is it so difficult to talk about difficult things? And more importantly, what I want to answer this morning is, why is it so difficult for Christians to talk about difficult things? Listen, with all that's going on in the world, we cannot ignore the ox in the room. But enough of that. Why don't we just go into the message already in progress? I hope you enjoy it. Come on, let's go. Heard me say earlier that it's often difficult to talk about difficult subjects. And I even asked the question, why is it difficult for Christians to talk about difficult subjects? And so when we look out on our world and we see a lot of the things that are happening, it's sometimes very difficult to have honest discussions about what's happening in our world, particularly as it comes to race and equality and things that can often be very emotional. So why is it so hard for us to talk about those things? See, I think it's almost as though as Christians, it's difficult to talk about difficult things because we are far more comfortable talking about people who differ from us than we are competent at talking with people who are different from us. You know, there's a scripture in the book of Proverbs, a book that we're going to be studying starting next week in our new series. And it's in Proverbs chapter 14, verse 4. Here's what it says. Just hang with me. It says, where no oxen are, the manger is clean, but revenue comes by strength of the ox. Let me read that again. Proverbs 14, verse 4. This is New Living Translation. It says, where no oxen are, the manger is clean, but much revenue comes by strength of the ox. You got to know that it actually costs a lot to feed an ox, to care for an ox, and let's be honest, it all actually is also a lot to clean up after an ox. I mean, they're big, smelly animals. And everyone kind of knew that, but this proverb says that while those are things that are going to be costly for you as a farmer, and yes, if you don't keep an ox in your manger or in your stall, you can make sure that it stays clean. You'll never have to clean up after the ox. You'll never have to feed the ox. Everything will be clean and sanitized and kept neat and tidy. But here's the deal. If you don't have an ox, nothing's going to grow. And so maybe the wisdom that's found in this proverb, one that I want to share with us this morning, is that no one grows and no one benefits by avoiding the hard stuff, avoiding things that may cost a little bit, avoiding discussions. This is what the proverb means, that there's no wisdom to be gained by avoiding the potential mess of talking about controversial topics. Here's what he's saying. You can avoid having an ox in your stall, and everything will be nice and neat, but nothing will grow, and no one will profit. See, I think American Christianity has rendered us incompetent at discussing controversial issues. And so my goal this morning is not to actually talk about those controversial issues, and I pray that you're talking about them. As a diverse church, we need to talk about what's going on in our world, the issues of race and justice and all the things that we've been discussing. We need to talk about that, but this message is not about me talking about that. This message is to help us to understand how to talk about it and to understand why it's become so difficult for us to talk about those topics. So let's stop there. Let's find somewhere else to talk about this, and let's continue talking about this difficult subject. Kind of had to leave from outside because it got a little bit noisy. And as much as I love being outside, sometimes it's hard to focus, especially it's hard to communicate with you guys because it gets a bit noisy outside. And that's sort of like this whole idea called relativism. It's this idea that everything is true. Every single noise that's coming in to our ears and to our computers and to our TV screens, those are sort of all competing with our ability to talk with one another in a way that's Christ-like. And so let me sort of explain to you maybe some of the reasons why it's difficult for us to have conversations. Think of it of all of the noise that continues to make it hard for us to talk with one another. Or the noise tells us that everything is true. And what ends up happening is that we reject what's called a meta-narrative, which simply means that there's a big story or a big picture or a big idea or a big principle. And when there's too much noise, we forget that there's a big idea or there's a big story that's working in play, or there's a big narrative, or there's a big picture to everything that's going on. And because of all the noise, we tend to forget that, or we tend to think that the big idea or the big picture or the grand narrative doesn't matter. Part of the noise that we continue to have to deal with that makes it so difficult to talk about difficult things is that somehow we start to believe that knowledge cannot transcend. In other words, content. It means that we have started to believe that the only thing that is true is only true in my group. We tend to discount the stories and the narratives and the experiences of other people because it may not have been something that my group has experienced. Most of you know that I write books, and my publisher actually sent me a really cool book that's about writing. It's called How to Write Better. But really, it's about how to be a better communicator, how to communicate your ideas and your thoughts and even your experiences in a way that helps others to learn about you. And one of the things that he talks about in this book is that because we've had so much noise and because we as Christians have allowed what's called relativism to creep into our Christian faith, we have lost, watch this, the art of persuasion. Persuasion is not something that's bad. In actuality, it's sort of the cornerstone and the foundation of our faith that ought to go out and persuade people to become Christ followers, persuade them with our words, persuade them with our lifestyle, persuade them with how we live and how we have faith. But when relativism or noise creeps into our faith, it makes it much harder to persuade people. Because think about it, if everyone thinks that what they have to say is true, then there is no such thing as an objective truth. There is no such thing as a big story. There is no such thing as a God whose truth stands above all truth. And if that's the case, then it's hard to persuade someone to believe something other than what they already believe. It's hard to persuade someone to abandon a belief that may be incorrect about God or about other human beings if everyone thinks that everyone is right. And think about it this way. When persuasion is no longer possible, then the only thing that we're left with is coercion. Here's what the author of this book says. He says that if society rejects influence, only power remains. That makes it really hard to talk about really hard things, because if I cannot influence you with love or with the way that I live my life or with words that come from God himself, if persuasion is no longer an option, if I cannot persuade you by the way that I live and the way that I serve Jesus and the way that I read how Jesus teaches us to treat others, if that's no longer an option, then the only thing that we're left with is power. And what ends up happening is, you know this, when I want to have a difficult conversation about a difficult topic and I don't know how to persuade you with sharing with you what God has said in his word, then the only resort that is left is to control. You know, there's a story in the book of Galatians where Paul actually has to have a difficult conversation with a fellow believer about something that he was doing that didn't really represent the truth of God's word. Here's what Paul says: "But when Peter came to Antioch, I had to oppose him to his face, for what he did was very wrong. When he first arrived, He ate with the Gentile believers. Gentiles are those who are non-Jewish, both religiously and ethnically. He says when he first arrived, he ate with Gentile believers. He ate with non-Jewish people who were also Christians, but who were not circumcised. But afterward, when some friends of James came, Peter wouldn't eat with the Gentiles anymore. He was afraid of criticism from these people who insisted the necessity of circumcision. As a result, listen to this, other Jewish believers followed Peter's strong word Paul is getting ready to use here, hypocrisy. And even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. Paul says, I had to confront Peter to his face. Did you hear what he says? Because when I saw, watch this, that he was not living up to the truth of the gospel. That's important to remember, because as we're dealing with difficult situations and difficult conversations, here's what Paul shows us, that he was willing to have a difficult conversation with a fellow follower of Christ, and he was willing to confront him, not because he was personally offended by Peter's behavior, but because he witnessed Peter, a fellow believer, someone that he knew was a Christ follower. He had to have a difficult conversation about a difficult topic because Peter was not following the truth of the gospel. The gospel addresses, listen, both our private and personal sin and societal sin. Paul confronted Peter because when he refused to embrace the people who were different from him, when he began to retreat from those who he was actually beginning to develop a relationship with, when Paul saw that, he realized that this is going to lead a lot of people astray. And because Peter was not following the truth of the gospel, Paul says, I had to have a difficult conversation with Peter about race, about ethnicity, about equality, about his own personal sin, but also the sin of retreating from those conversations and retreating from those people that God has called us to be with. Well, listen to this. The church must maintain the discipline to discern when it's being duplicitous, because that's going to cause us to have difficult conversations about difficult topics. But you remember what the proverb said? That, yeah, you can get away with not having an ox in your stable or in your manger, and you can keep everything clean and nice and neat, but you'll never grow. Here's 5 things that I want you to consider as we talk about difficult things. Number 1, respect the truth as best as we can know it and speak in a way that reflects it. Use credible information and sources when you're having difficult conversations about difficult topics. If the source, listen to me, always confirms your perspective, or if a source you're using always challenges your perspective, can I let you in on a secret? That source is probably biased. Our job is to honor what is true. Here's the second thing. Be truthful about contrary viewpoints. What do you mean, Pastor? In other words, don't misrepresent other perspectives. Sometimes, let's be honest, when someone disagrees with me or when a source disagrees with me, I'll have a tendency, and you'll have a tendency to misrepresent what that person or what that source is actually saying, because then it makes it easier for me to debunk what they're saying as fact. So if you're going to have difficult conversations about difficult topics with people who have a different perspective, do not dishonor their perspective by being dishonest about their perspective. Study what other people are saying and make sure that you fully understand their viewpoint. And when you go to have a discussion that may disagree with their viewpoint, at least honor the integrity of their view by stating it truthfully. Number 3, if we're going to have difficult conversations about difficult subjects, number 3, give credit where credit is due. Don't claim ideas as your own. This helps to avoid the romanticizing of your own intellect. Who doesn't want to seem smart and intelligent and informed? Here's the problem, that oftentimes when we go into difficult conversations about difficult subjects, we will take someone else's ideas and viewpoints and represent them as our own. Don't become a talking head with other people's talking points. Can I be honest with you? Lean in. That's lazy. Seek to learn about the issues you're attempting to discuss. And even when you use sources, make sure that you say where those sources are coming from. Okay, number 4, when I have difficult conversations about difficult subjects, be careful in your use of logic. Here's the number one thing that trips us up when we're trying to have difficult conversations about difficult subjects. Here it is. Correlation doesn't mean causation. It is a clever tool to discredit an idea, but let's be honest, doing that is dishonest. Let's be honest, we're Christians. Let's have difficult conversations here. Doing that is dishonest. So don't become the type of person who does the following. You use generalizations, you use false analogies, you demonize your opponents, or you avoid the central issue. Okay, number 5, we're going to have difficult conversations about difficult subjects. Show humility. And can I just tell you, with all your research and with all your talking points and with all of the things that you've gathered to make your point, it's possible that you still could be wrong. Be a lifelong learner. Be willing to allow your mind to be changed by the truth of God's narrative. And in doing that, allow your beliefs, if they're wrong, to be changed. Remember where we started. Where there are no oxen, the manger will stay clean. So listen, after this message, if you still want to avoid difficult conversations about difficult topics, particularly as it relates to what's going on into our country, then don't talk about it. And your life will stay nice and neat and clean and in a box, and you'll never be upset, and you'll never slip up and say the wrong thing accidentally. But I gotta promise you, the word is true. If you do that, you will never grow and you will never profit by not engaging in difficult conversations about difficult topics. Look, oxen are large, messy animals that are difficult to deal with and even more difficult to clean up after. But not having them present, the writer of the proverb says, means no growth, no progress, no revenue. It's easy to avoid the tough topics because we don't want to get messy. But the truth is, avoiding it may very well be costing us everything.